I did it. Is that a valid statement of guilt? The purpose of an interrogation is to learn the truth, and in most instances this consists of the guilty suspect telling the investigator that they committed the crime, the details about why and how they did it. And the reason this is the most common outcome is because interrogation should be reserved for those instances in which the investigative information clearly indicates the subject's probable involvement. However, there can be other successful outcomes. The subject may disclose to the investigator that he didn't commit the crime, but he knows and has been concealing who did. Or he may acknowledge that during the course of the investigation, he lied about some significant piece of information, such as his alibi, because he didn't want people to know where he was at this particular time. And an additional successful outcome is when the investigator decides that based on the interrogation process and what the subject is saying, he should be eliminated from suspicion and no longer be investigated for commission of this act. When a subject says, I did it, I did the crime, I committed the act, to determine the probable truthfulness and trustworthiness of a confession requires an analysis of the circumstances surrounding and the content of the interrogation, as well as a number of intrinsic factors within the suspect who offered the statement. The investigator should attempt in every case to make sure that when a subject says they committed the act in question, it is a truthful statement. An acknowledgement by the subject of their involvement in the commission of the crime should include corroborating information, dependent and or independent corroboration. Dependent corroboration consists of information about the crime that the investigator knew but intentionally withheld from the media, from the public, and from the subjects they interviewed. So in other words, the only people who would have this information would be the investigators and the actual person who perpetrated the crime. Examples of dependent information include the denomination of the currency that was stolen in a robbery, the origin of a fire in an arson, or the nature and location of injuries to a homicide victim, or the type of murder weapon that was used. The second type of corroborative information is called independent corroboration. This describes details about the crime that the investigator did not know until after the confession. Examples of independent corroboration include the location of the murder weapon or the bloody clothes the offender was wearing at the time, the recovery of the stolen property, verification of the subject's planning activities prior to the event and the post-crime activities, and how we got into the building, etc. Details that even the investigator did not know at the time. Now, it must be remembered that the same instincts that cause guilty suspects to generally deny their involvement in committing the act can also result in confessions that contain missing or erroneous information. The requirement that a confession perfectly match the crime scene, the victim's account, or be completely accurate in every detail is simply not realistic. Rather, a balance of interests must be achieved wherein the court, when deciding the trustworthiness of a confession, considers the totality of circumstances surrounding that acknowledgement of guilt. So with that discussion in mind, the following represents some factors to consider in the assessment of the credibility of a subject's confession. Now, of course, each case has to be evaluated with respect to the totality of circumstances surrounding the interrogation and confession. But these are certainly some elements that should be given careful consideration. With respect to the subject's condition at the time of the interrogation, their physical condition, including possible drug or alcohol intoxication, their mental capacity, their psychological condition, the subject's age, their prior experience with law enforcement, their understanding of the language, the length of the interrogation, the degree of detail provided by the subject during the confession, the extent of corroboration between what they told the investigators and the actual crime scene, the presence of witnesses who saw and heard the interrogation and confession and can testify as to what may have occurred. The suspect's behavior during the interrogation process, and the presence of any improper interrogation techniques such as physical abuse, threats of harm or inevitable consequences, promises of leniency, denial of rights, denial of the chance to satisfy their physical needs. The Reid technique is in complete compliance with all judicial guidelines and decisions regarding acceptable interrogation practices. These, for example, are our core principles. Always treat the subject with dignity and respect. Always conduct interviews and interrogations in accordance with the guidelines established by the courts. Do not make any promises of leniency, threats of harm, or threats of inevitable consequences. Do not conduct interrogations for an extensively lengthy period of time. Do not deny the subject any of their rights, and do not deny the subject the opportunity to satisfy their physical needs. And finally, the investigator should exercise special cautions when questioning socially immature juveniles or individuals who have mental or psychological impairments. When a false confession occurs, it is not the technique that is the genesis, but rather the introduction of an element, most frequently a threat of harm and or a promise of leniency, that violates the best practices and the core principles of the Reid technique. In a prior investigator tip entitled "What Questions Should Be Asked to Determine the Voluntariness and Validity of a Subject's Confession," we list dozens of questions that should be asked to determine the voluntariness and validity of the statement, "I did it." We also recommend that you review the investigator tip "False Confessions: The Issues to be Considered." The investigator tips can be found on our website at reid.com, and of course our book, Criminal Interrogation and Confessions, has extensive information on the topic. Thank you very much for taking a few minutes to listen to this presentation.